Sometimes the most painful wounds are the ones nobody can see. For 23 years, Cordelia has lived in her sister's shadow, watching the world choose beauty over kindness, perfection over heart. In the village of Ravenshollow, Lord Alaric awakens every 100 years to choose a bride. Everyone expects him to pick Evangeline, golden, graceful, and beloved by all. But when the ancient vampire looks past the perfect sister and points to scarred, forgotten Cordelia, the entire village gasps in shock. Why would an immortal lord choose the damaged girl over the beautiful one? The answer lies buried in memories older than anyone alive can remember. Old Martha, the sister's nursemaid, begins to recall fragments of a story she thought she'd forgotten, a tale of love, loss, and a promise made in desperation. What secret connects this ancient vampire to the girl everyone pities? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Ravenshollow like a shroud, weaving between the crooked chimneys and settling in the cobblestone streets that had known centuries of secrets. Beneath the crumbling towers of Blackmoor Castle, the village had learned to live with shadows, both literal and metaphorical. The ancient stones of the castle walls bore witness to countless generations who had called this place home, their lives intertwined with the dark legend that emerged once every 100 years. In the modest but well-kept Thornfield Manor at the village's heart, two sisters prepared for what many believed would be the most important day of their lives. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls understood the weight of the approaching ceremony. Tapestries that had been woven by their grandmother's grandmother hung in the main hall, their colours faded, but their intricate patterns still telling stories of love, loss, and enduring hope. Evangeline Thornfield stood before the great mirror in her chambers, her reflection a vision that had inspired countless poems from the village's young men. Golden hair cascaded down her back like spun sunlight, and her blue eyes held the clarity of a summer sky. At 25, she possessed the kind of beauty that seemed almost otherworldly, the sort that made grown men stumble over their words and children stare in wonder. Her gown for the ceremony had been crafted by the finest seamstress in 3 counties, its ivory silk adorned with delicate pearls that caught the light with every movement. "You look like an angel descended from heaven itself," proclaimed Lady Margaret Thornfield, her voice thick with pride and barely contained emotion. The elder woman's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her daughter's necklace, a family heirloom that had been worn by Thornfield brides for generations. "Lord Alaric would be a fool not to choose you," Evangeline smiled, but there was a tightness around her eyes that spoke of pressure and expectation. The entire village had been preparing for this moment since her 18th birthday. Seamstresses had competed for the honor of creating her ceremonial gown, poets had written verses about her grace, and the local priest had offered special prayers for her selection. The weight of their hopes pressed down upon her shoulders like a mantle she could never remove. "Mother, what if?" Evangeline began, but Lady Margaret quickly silenced her with a gentle finger to her lips. "No doubts, my dear. Not today. You are everything any man, mortal or otherwise, could desire. Beauty, grace, intelligence, and a heart pure as mountain snow. The Lord would be blessed beyond measure to claim you as his bride." Down the hall, in a smaller chamber that caught only the morning's weakest light, Cordelia Thornfield sat by her window, watching the village come alive with preparations. Her room was simpler than her sister's, fewer mirrors, more books, and a collection of small treasures that spoke of a quieter, more introspective nature. The centerpiece of her modest space was an ornate music box that had been her most cherished possession since childhood. Its melody, a haunting tune that seemed to carry whispers of ancient sorrows, was the only thing that could calm her restless spirit after the nightmares that had plagued her since the accident. The accident. Even after 15 years, Cordelia could recall every detail with crystalline clarity. She had been 8 years old, exploring the old mill by the stream that ran through Thornfield lands. The wooden beam had rotted through, and when it collapsed, it had taken with it not only her childhood innocence, but also the left side of her face. The scars ran from her temple to her jaw, 3 jagged lines that had never properly healed despite the ministrations of every healer her parents could afford. Where Evangeline drew, admiring glances, Cordelia inspired either pity or uncomfortable silence. The villagers had learned to look away when she passed, not from cruelty, but from the awkward awareness that they didn't know how to interact with someone so visibly marked by misfortune. Children would whisper behind their hands, and young men would focus their attention entirely on her sister whenever both were present. "My dear Cordelia," came a weathered voice from the doorway. Old Martha shuffled into the room, her aged hands carrying a tea tray with the precision of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. Martha had been with the Thornfield family for over 60 years, arriving as a young woman to care for Lady Margaret in her infancy, and remaining to raise both daughters with the fierce devotion of someone who had never had children of her own. Martha's face bore the lines of a life well lived, her silver hair always pulled back in a practical bun, and her grey eyes held depths of wisdom that seemed to see beyond the present moment. She had been beautiful once, the village elders claimed, but Martha rarely spoke of her youth. Her past remained largely mysterious, glimpsed only in the way she would sometimes pause in her work, staring into the distance as if seeing ghosts that only she could perceive. "You're brooding again, child," Martha said gently, setting down the tray and settling into the chair beside Cordelia's window seat. "Your mind is spinning like a mill wheel after spring rain." Cordelia managed a weak smile. "How can I not brood, Martha? Today, Lord Alaric chooses his bride, and the entire village acts as if the outcome is already decided. They speak of Evangeline's beauty and grace as if I'm not even in the room. Sometimes I wonder if I'm invisible to everyone except you." Martha's expression grew troubled, and for a moment her eyes took on that distant look that had become more frequent in recent months. "Invisible," she murmured, almost to herself. "Yes, that can be a blessing and a curse, can't it? Sometimes being unseen means being protected from things that would otherwise destroy us." "What do you mean?" Cordelia asked, but Martha seemed to shake herself back to the present. "Nothing, dear one. Just the ramblings of an old woman whose mind wanders too often these days." Martha reached out and gently touched Cordelia's scarred cheek with a tenderness that had never wavered in 15 years. "But know this, true worth is not measured by what others see when they look at us. It's measured by what lives within our hearts, and yours, my dear girl, is pure gold." The ceremony itself was a tradition that stretched back 3 centuries, to the first time Lord Alaric had awakened from his mystical slumber. The vampire lord was bound by ancient magic to choose a bride once every 100 years, granting her immortality and taking her as his companion for the coming century. Some said it was a curse. Others claimed it was the greatest honor a woman could receive. The truth, like so many things in Ravenshollow, remained shrouded in mystery and speculation. The great hall of Blackmoor Castle had been prepared for the occasion. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, and tapestries bearing the ancient coat of arms, a raven in flight beneath a blood-red moon, hung from the rafters. The villagers gathered in their finest clothes, their faces a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and barely concealed fear. At the far end of the hall stood an ornate chair that served as Lord Alaric's throne, its dark wood carved with symbols that predated the village itself. Before it sat a pedestal holding a tarnished silver chalice, the ceremonial vessel used in the selection ritual. The chalice bore ancient runes that few could read, their meaning lost to all but the most learned scholars of forgotten tongues. Lord Reginald Thornfield stood with his wife and daughters near the front of the gathering, his usually jovial face grave with the weight of the moment. He was a man who had built his fortune through honest trade and fair dealing, respected throughout the county for his integrity and kindness. But today, he looked older than his 52 years, the reality of potentially losing a daughter to immortality weighing heavily upon his shoulders. "Remember, girls," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd, "no matter what happens today, you are both my precious daughters, and that will never change." Evangeline nodded gracefully, her composure perfect despite the magnitude of the moment. Cordelia simply squeezed her father's hand, finding comfort in his steady presence. She had never expected to be chosen, the very idea seemed absurd. But being here, watching her sister prepare for what seemed inevitable, brought its own kind of pain. The crowd fell silent as midnight approached. Ancient magic stirred in the stones of the castle, and the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation. Somewhere in the depths of the castle, Lord Alaric was awakening from his century-long slumber, preparing to choose the woman who would share his immortal existence. Martha stood behind the Thornfield family, but her usual steadiness seemed shaken. Her hands trembled as she clutched her worn shawl, and her eyes darted nervously between the two sisters. In the candlelight, her face appeared almost haunted, as if she were seeing not the present ceremony but some ghost from the distant past. "Martha," Lady Margaret whispered, noticing the old woman's distress, "are you unwell?" But Martha didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the ceremonial chalice, and her lips moved silently, as if she were reciting words from a prayer, or perhaps a warning that only she could remember. The castle bells began to toll midnight, their deep, resonant chimes echoing through the valley and settling into the bones of everyone present. The ceremony of selection was about to begin, and with it, the revelation of a choice that would change everything the people of Ravenshollow thought they knew about fate, love, and the true nature of the ancient lord who held their village in his immortal hands. As the final bell faded into silence, the great doors of the hall creaked open, and Lord Alaric stepped into the candlelight. His presence filled the room like a wave, commanding attention without effort. Tall and pale, with dark hair that seemed to absorb light, and eyes that held the depth of centuries, he was both beautiful and terrible to behold. His gaze swept across the assembled villagers before settling on the group of young women who had been presented for his consideration. The moment of choice had arrived, and with it, the beginning of a story that would challenge everything the people of Ravenshollow believed about love, sacrifice, and the hidden connections that bind souls across the passage of time. Lord Alaric moved through the great hall, with the fluid grace of a predator, his footsteps silent on the ancient stone floor. The assembled villagers seemed to hold their collective breath as he approached the ceremonial chalice, his pale fingers tracing the tarnished silver rim with reverent care. The runes etched into the metal began to glow with a faint, otherworldly light at his touch, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls like living things. "People of Ravenshollow," his voice resonated through the hall, rich and hypnotic, carrying the weight of centuries. "Once again, the time has come for the ancient compact to be fulfilled. A bride shall be chosen, a bond shall be forged, and the cycle shall continue." The vampire lord's appearance was both magnificent and unsettling. His dark hair fell in waves to his shoulders, framing features that were sharp and aristocratic. His skin held the marble pallor of one who had not seen sunlight for 300 years, yet there was nothing sickly about his bearing. He commanded attention through sheer presence, as if the very air around him bent to his will. His clothing spoke of nobility from a bygone era, a black velvet coat adorned with silver thread, dark trousers that emphasized his tall frame, and boots that had been crafted by artisans long dead. But it was his eyes that truly captured the crowd's attention. They were deep green, like forest pools at midnight, and they held depths of knowledge and sorrow that spoke of a soul far older than his physical form suggested. "Let the candidates step forward," Lord Alaric commanded, his gaze sweeping across the gathering. 12 young women had been presented for consideration, each dressed in their finest gowns and accompanied by their families. They formed a semicircle before the throne, their faces showing varying degrees of nervousness, hope, and fear. Among them, Evangeline stood like a golden beacon, her beauty seeming to radiate light in the candlelit hall. Lord Alaric began his inspection, moving slowly from one candidate to the next. He would pause before each woman, studying her face with an intensity that made several of them tremble. His expression remained impassive, revealing nothing of his thoughts or preferences. When he reached Evangeline, the entire hall seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Here was the obvious choice, the village beauty, the one every man desired and every woman envied. Lord Alaric studied her for a long moment, his green eyes taking in every detail of her perfect features. "You are indeed beautiful, Lady Evangeline," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine appreciation. "Your grace would honor any man's hall." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Evangeline curtsied gracefully, her cheeks flushed with pleasure at the compliment. But then Lord Alaric stepped back, his hand not reaching for the ceremonial chalice. Instead, his gaze continued down the line of candidates. The hall fell silent again, confusion beginning to replace certainty. Cordelia stood at the far end of the semicircle, partially hidden in the shadows cast by a stone pillar. She had positioned herself there deliberately, hoping to remain as inconspicuous as possible during what she assumed would be her sister's moment of triumph. Her simple blue dress, while well made, seemed plain compared to the elaborate gowns of the other candidates. When Lord Alaric's eyes found her, something extraordinary happened. The vampire lord stopped moving entirely, his body going rigid as if struck by lightning. His centuries-old composure cracked, revealing a flash of recognition so intense that several villagers gasped audibly. "You," he whispered, the single word carrying more emotion than any speech. Cordelia pressed herself back against the pillar, her scarred cheek burning with shame at being singled out for what she assumed was rejection or pity. "My lord, step into the light," Lord Alaric commanded, his voice gentle but firm. Trembling, Cordelia obeyed, moving forward until the candlelight fell fully across her face. The scars were clearly visible now, 3 jagged lines that had never properly healed despite years of treatment. The hall was so quiet that the sound of her nervous breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Lord Alaric approached her slowly, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. When he reached her, he lifted one pale hand toward her face, stopping just short of touching her damaged skin. "Do you know who you are?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I am Cordelia Thornfield, my lord," she stammered, confusion evident in her dark eyes. Something like pain flickered across the vampire's features. "No," he said softly, "you are so much more than that." From his coat, Lord Alaric withdrew an ornate pendant, a bloodstone set in an intricate silver mounting that seemed to pulse with its own inner size, fire. This was the traditional symbol of the chosen bride, worn by every woman who had been selected over the past 3 centuries. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he stepped toward Evangeline, the pendant in his outstretched hand. For a moment, it seemed he would place it around her neck as expected. But when the bloodstone came within inches of her throat, something remarkable occurred. The pendant began to smoke, its silver mounting growing so hot that Lord Alaric was forced to pull it away. The bloodstone itself seemed to recoil from Evangeline's proximity, its dark surface losing all luster and becoming dull as coal. "Interesting," Lord Alaric murmured, turning back toward Cordelia. As he approached her with the pendant, the transformation was immediate and dramatic. The bloodstone burst into brilliant crimson light, its surface becoming so radiant that it cast ruby shadows throughout the hall. The silver mounting, which had burned at Evangeline's nearness, now felt cool and welcoming against Lord Alaric's palm. Without hesitation, he placed the chain around Cordelia's neck. The moment the bloodstone touched her skin, it pulsed once with blinding intensity before settling into a steady, warm glow that seemed to emanate from within her very soul. By the ancient compact, and the power invested in me by blood and time, Lord, Alaric announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, I choose Cordelia Thornfield as my bride and eternal companion. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, as if a dam had burst, the hall erupted in chaos. This cannot be! Lord Blackthorn, a nobleman from a neighbouring estate, pushed through the crowd. The scarred girl, over Evangeline? My lord, surely you jest. Have you taken leave of your senses? Lady Pemberton shrieked, her voice cutting through the babble of confused voices. She's damaged goods, a marked woman. Evangeline stood frozen in place, her perfect features contorted with shock and humiliation. The golden girl, who had never faced rejection in her entire life, now found herself publicly dismissed in favor of the sister she had always pitied. Evangeline, Cordelia whispered, reaching toward her sister, but Evangeline recoiled as if struck. Don't touch me, she hissed, her blue eyes blazing with fury and wounded pride. This is some kind of mistake. It has to be. Lady Margaret Thornfield pushed through the crowd toward her daughters, her face a mask of confusion and growing alarm. My lord, she addressed the vampire with trembling courage, surely there has been some error. Cordelia is not, she cannot be, what, Lady Margaret? Lord Alaric's voice cut through the din like a blade. Beautiful enough, perfect enough, worthy enough. His green eyes blazed with an authority that had been forged over centuries. I suggest you reconsider what you believe you know about Worth. Near the back of the hall, Martha had grown deathly pale. She swayed on her feet, one gnarled hand pressed against the stone wall for support. Her eyes were fixed on the bloodstone pendant around Cordelia's neck, and her lips moved in what might have been prayer or recognition. Martha, Lord Reginald noticed the old woman's distress and moved toward her. What is it? What's wrong? But before Martha could answer, her legs gave way beneath her. She collapsed to the floor, her weathered hands clutching at her chest as if trying to contain something that was fighting to escape. The promise, she gasped, her voice barely audible above the chaos. Oh, merciful God, the promise is coming due. As village men rushed to help the fallen nursemaid, Lord Alaric extended his hand toward Cordelia. The bloodstone pendant continued to pulse with warm light, as if it were a living heart beating in rhythm with her own. Come, he said simply. We have much to discuss, and very little time to waste. Cordelia looked back at her family, her father's stricken face, her mother's obvious distress, and Evangeline's bitter tears. Everything she had ever known was crumbling around her, replaced by mysteries she couldn't begin to understand. I don't understand any of this, she whispered. Lord Alaric's expression softened with something that might have been compassion. You will, he promised. But first, we must ensure that you survive long enough to learn the truth. The days following the selection ceremony passed in a blur of whispered conversations and barely concealed hostility. Ravenshollow had divided itself into factions, those who defended Lord Alaric's inexplicable choice, and those who viewed it as either madness or cruel jest. The Thornfield Manor, once a place of warmth and laughter, had become a house of strained silences and careful avoidances. Cordelia found herself confined to her chambers, not by Lord Alaric's command, but by the overwhelming weight of the village's disapproval. When she ventured into the pinning centre, conversations stopped mid-sentence, and mothers pulled their children closer as if her very presence might bring misfortune. The bloodstone pendant, which she had tried repeatedly to remove, seemed fused to her skin, its warm pulse a constant reminder of how drastically her life had changed. "They look at me like I've stolen something that wasn't mine to take," she confided to her reflection in the small mirror above her washbasin. The scars on her face seemed more prominent now, as if the stress of recent events had deepened the old wounds. Her music box sat open on the windowsill, its haunting melody providing the only comfort in her isolated world. The tune seemed different somehow, more melancholic, as if it too mourned the loss of her simple life. Sometimes, in the space between the notes, she thought she heard whispers, soft, feminine voices, speaking words she couldn't quite understand. Evangeline had taken to her bed with what Lady Margaret diplomatically called nervous exhaustion. The Golden Daughter's world had crumbled in a single moment, and she seemed unable to comprehend a reality where her beauty and grace had been found wanting. The few times Cordelia had attempted to visit her sister, she had been turned away by servants, acting on Evangeline's explicit instructions. "She needs time," Lady Margaret explained, though her own eyes held the same confusion and disappointment that plagued the entire village. "This has been a shock for all of us." But it was Martha's condition that worried Cordelia most. The old nursemaid had not spoken since her collapse in the great hall, lying in her small chamber beneath the manor's eaves, with her eyes closed and her breathing shallow. The village physician had examined her thoroughly, but found nothing physically wrong. Her heart beat steadily, her lungs drew breath without difficulty, yet she remained locked in what seemed like a waking sleep. On the third day after the ceremony, Cordelia could bear the isolation no longer. Lord Alaric had retreated to Blackmore Castle immediately after the selection, leaving her with questions that multiplied with each passing hour. The bloodstone pendant continued to pulse against her chest, sometimes growing warm when she least expected it, as if responding to thoughts or emotions she couldn't identify. Gathering her courage, she made her way through the village toward the castle. The streets were unusually empty for midday, and those few villagers she encountered quickly averted their eyes and hurried past. By the time she reached the castle gates, her resolve had nearly crumbled, but the pendant's gentle warmth seemed to encourage her forward. The guards, expecting her arrival, admitted her without question. Inside the castle walls, the atmosphere was different from the ceremony night, quieter, more contemplative, but also somehow more alive. Ancient magic seemed to flow through the very stones, and Cordelia could feel it responding to her presence in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. A servant led her through corridors she had never seen before, past tapestries that depicted scenes of battles fought in ages long past. The faces in the woven images seemed to watch her passage with knowing eyes, and more than once she caught herself stopping to study a particular figure that seemed hauntingly familiar. "His lordship awaits you in the tower study," the servant informed her, his voice carefully neutral. "He has been expecting your visit." The tower study was a circular room lined with books that must have numbered in the thousands. Tall windows offered views of the village below and the mountains beyond, while a fire crackled cheerfully in the stone hearth. Lord Alaric stood with his back to her, gazing out at the landscape with the stillness of one accustomed to long periods of contemplation. "You came," he said without turning around. "I wondered if you would find the courage." "I need answers," Cordelia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "The entire village thinks you've made some terrible mistake, and I'm beginning to wonder if they're right." Lord Alaric turned to face her, and in the afternoon light she could see details that had been hidden in the ceremony's candlelit shadows. His features were more refined than she had realized, with high cheekbones and a mouth that suggested both strength and sensitivity. But it was his eyes that captured her attention. Those deep, green depths held centuries of experience, yet when they looked at her, they seemed to see something that brought him both joy and profound sorrow. "Walk with me," he said, moving toward a narrow staircase that led higher into the tower. "There is something you must see." They climbed in silence, the stone steps worn smooth by countless feet over the centuries. The staircase ended at a heavy wooden door that Lord Alaric opened with an ornate iron key. Beyond lay a smaller chamber, dusty and clearly long unused, with only a single window to provide illumination. But it was the painting that dominated the room that made Cordelia gasp in shock. The portrait showed a young woman of perhaps 20 years, with dark hair arranged in an elaborate style popular centuries before. Her dress was rich burgundy velvet, adorned with gold embroidery that spoke of nobility and wealth. But it was her face that stole Cordelia's breath away. The features were her own, as if someone had painted her portrait before she was born. "Who is she?" Cordelia whispered, stepping closer to the canvas. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the set of her eyes and the curve of her mouth. Only the scars were missing. This woman's face was unmarked, perfect in its symmetry. Her name was Seraphina, Lord Alaric replied, his voice heavy with old pain. She was to be my bride 3 centuries ago, before the curse that binds me to this endless cycle of choosing and losing. Cordelia reached out as if to touch the painted face, then pulled her hand back. "But she looks exactly like you." "Yes." Lord Alaric moved to stand beside her, his gaze fixed on the portrait with the intensity of one seeing a ghost made manifest. "The resemblance is not coincidence, Cordelia. Nothing about your selection was random or cruel whim." The bloodstone pendant grew warm against her chest, pulsing in rhythm with her racing heartbeat. "I don't understand. How is this possible? What does this woman have to do with me?" Before Lord Alaric could answer, a commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention to the window. Cordelia could see a small crowd gathering around what appeared to be an overturned cart, its contents scattered across the cobblestones. Among the villagers she recognized Father Benedict, the elderly priest whose sermons often touched on the mysteries of faith and divine providence. Father Benedict has been the keeper of the village records for over 40 years, Lord Alaric observed, following her gaze. Perhaps it is time he shared some of the secrets he has so carefully guarded. As they watched, the priest bent to retrieve what looked like a leather-bound book from among the scattered items. But as he straightened, his eyes lifted toward the tower window where they stood. Even from this distance, Cordelia could see the recognition in his weathered face and the fear that accompanied it. "He knows something," she breathed. "Father Benedict knows many things," Lord Alaric agreed. "The question is whether he can be persuaded to share them before it's too late." That night, sleep eluded Cordelia entirely. The image of Seraphina's face haunted her thoughts, the uncanny resemblance raising questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. She paced her chamber like a caged animal, the bloodstone pendant's gentle pulse, the only constant in a world that had suddenly become alien and frightening. Near midnight, desperate for distraction, she decided to check on Martha. The old nursemaid's continued silence had become a source of growing anxiety for the entire household. As Cordelia climbed the narrow stairs to the servants' quarters, she noticed that Martha's door stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of candlelight within. "Martha?" she called softly, pushing the door open wider. The elderly woman sat upright in her narrow bed, her eyes open but strangely vacant, as if she were seeing something far beyond the confines of her small chamber. Her lips moved continuously, in what might have been prayer or recitation, but no sound emerged. On the small table beside her bed, several yellowed papers lay scattered, their edges torn as if they had been hastily removed from their hiding place. Cordelia approached cautiously, her attention drawn to the papers. As she drew closer, she recognized Martha's careful handwriting, though the ink had faded with age. These were diary entries, written in Martha's younger hand, dating back over 20 years. "Martha, what are these?" Cordelia asked gently, but the old woman gave no indication that she had heard. With trembling fingers, Cordelia gathered the scattered pages, carrying them to the window where moonlight provided enough illumination to read. The first entry was dated 23 years ago, shortly before Cordelia's birth. Asterisk. The dreams have returned again, more vivid than ever. I see her face so clearly now, my beloved Sira, the child I could not save. The master says I must not speak of what happened, that the past is buried and must remain so. But how can I forget the promise I made? How can I pretend that love can be so easily erased? Asterisk. Cordelia's hands shook as she read. Sarah. The name was close to Seraphina, too close to be coincidence. She turned to the next fragment. Asterisk. Lady Margaret delivered safely this morning. The child is perfect, unmarked by the shadows that have haunted our family for so long. When I first held her, I felt a chill of recognition that nearly stopped my heart. Her eyes, they are Sira's eyes, looking at me across the years. Is this his mercy or his judgment? I cannot tell, but I will guard this child with my life, as I failed to guard the first. Asterisk. The words blurred as tears filled Cordelia's eyes. Martha had never spoken of another child, never mentioned anyone named Sira, yet these entries painted a picture of loss and secrets that ran deeper than anything Cordelia had imagined. The next legible fragment was dated several years later. Asterisk. Little Cordelia grows more like her with each passing day. The resemblance is becoming impossible to ignore, though God be praised, no one else seems to notice. Sometimes I catch her humming the old song Sira's Lullaby, though I know no one has taught it to her. How is such a thing possible? The priests speak of souls that cross between worlds, of love that transcends death itself. Could it be? Asterisk. A terrible choice approaches. Lord Blackthorn's heir has been asking questions about the old records, about what happened all those years ago. If he discovers the truth about Sira, about what we did to protect her, then Cordelia will be in danger too. The sins of the past have a way of reaching across time to claim new victims. I must destroy these pages before someone finds them. But I cannot bring myself to burn the only record of my beloved child. Perhaps it is enough to hide them where only I will ever think to look. Asterisk. Cordelia sank into the chair beside Martha's bed, the pages trembling in her grasp. Martha had had a child named Sira, or rather Seraphina. The timeline would make her roughly 3 centuries old, which was impossible unless she wasn't mortal, Cordelia whispered to herself. She turned to Martha, studying the old woman's vacant expression with new eyes. Who are you really, Martha, and what happened to your daughter? As if responding to the question, Martha's lips began to move more distinctly. Her voice emerged as barely a whisper, but Cordelia could make out individual words. Promise to protect her, Martha murmured. Promise to keep the bloodline safe. Failed once, cannot fail again. The master comes for what is his, but love finds a way. Love always finds a way. A chill ran down Cordelia's spine. What, master? Martha, please, I need to understand. But the old woman had fallen silent again, her eyes closing as she settled back against her pillow. Cordelia gathered the remaining diary fragments, her mind racing with implications she barely dared consider. If Martha had lived for 3 centuries, if Seraphina had been her daughter, then the connection between herself and the woman in the portrait might be more than mere coincidence. She made her way back to her own chamber, the diary pages hidden beneath her nightgown. Once safely behind her closed door, she spread them on her writing desk and lit additional candles to better examine the text. Several more fragments contained references to the promise and the bloodline, but the handwriting on these was different, shakier, as if written under extreme duress. One particular entry made her blood run cold. Asterisk. He has found us, despite all our precautions. Lord Blackthorn's ancestor discovered the truth about Sira's parentage, about what she truly was. They came in the night with silver and fire, intending to end the bloodline forever. I managed to get her away, but not before God forgive me, not before the fire touched her face. Asterisk. We fled to the old sanctuary, but she was dying. The burns were too severe, the silver too pure. In desperation, I sought out the only power that might save her, the ancient lord who slumbers beneath the castle. The price he demanded was terrible, but what mother would not pay any cost to save her child? The binding was complete, but something went wrong. Instead of preserving her life, it scattered her soul across time, ensuring she would return again and again until the debt was paid. Each incarnation would bear the mark of her death scars that would serve as both protection and recognition. Asterisk. Cordelia's hand flew to her own scarred cheek, her heart pounding with the terrible possibility that Martha's entries suggested. The fire that had scarred Serafina centuries ago, could it somehow be connected to her own childhood accident? She thought of the mill beam that had collapsed, the way the fire had seemed to come from nowhere, burning her face, despite the fact that no flames should have been present. She had always assumed it was some freak accident involving friction or sparks from the machinery, but what if there had been something more supernatural at work? A soft knock at her door interrupted her racing thoughts. "Miss Cordelia," came a servant's voice, "your sister wishes to speak with you." Cordelia quickly hid the diary fragments beneath her mattress before opening the door. The young maid looked nervous, twisting her hands in her apron. "Evangeline wants to see me?" Cordelia asked, surprised. Her sister had refused all contact since the ceremony. "Yes, miss, she's in the garden pavilion," she said. The maid hesitated. "She said she has something important to tell you about the old stories, about things that happened before you were born." As Cordelia made her way through the moonlit garden toward the pavilion where her sister waited, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth she sought was finally within reach, and that it might be more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The garden pavilion stood bathed in moonlight, its white marble columns casting long shadows across the carefully tended flower beds. Evangeline sat on the stone bench within, her golden hair appearing almost silver in the pale light. She had wrapped herself in a dark cloak that made her seem smaller, more vulnerable than Cordelia had ever seen her. "Sister," Evangeline called softly as Cordelia approached, "thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would, after how I've treated you." Cordelia settled onto the bench beside her, noting the red-rimmed eyes and hollow cheeks that spoke of sleepless nights and tearful days. "You've been through a shock, Evangeline. We all have. Have you ever wondered why Mother never speaks of her childhood?" Evangeline asked abruptly, her gaze fixed on the rose bushes that bordered the pavilion. "Why there are no portraits of her family in our home, no stories of grandparents or aunts or cousins?" The question caught Cordelia off guard. "I suppose I assumed they had all passed away before we were old enough to know them." Evangeline shook her head slowly. "I thought the same until I started searching through Father's papers after the ceremony. I needed to understand why Lord Alaric chose you, what made you different. What I found instead was evidence of secrets that run much deeper than his preference for—" She stopped herself, perhaps realizing how cruel her words sounded. "For the scarred sister over the beautiful one?" Cordelia finished quietly. "Cordelia, I'm sorry. I've been so focused on my own wounded pride that I failed to see the danger you might be in." Evangeline turned to face her fully. "Mother's maiden name wasn't Ashworth, as we've always been told. It was Ravenshollow. She's a direct descendant of the family that founded this village 3 centuries ago." The revelation hit Cordelia like a physical blow. Ravenshollow? But that name appears in all the old stories about Lord Alaric's first intended bride, Evangeline confirmed. "The woman who died before the ceremony could be completed, the one whose death supposedly bound him to this eternal cycle of selection." Cordelia's mind raced back to the portrait in the tower, to Serafina's noble bearing and expensive clothing. If Mother is descended from the Ravenshollow line, then we are her blood descendants. Yes. Evangeline reached beneath her cloak and withdrew a small object wrapped in silk. I found this hidden in Mother's jewelry box, behind a false panel that I discovered purely by accident. She unwrapped the silk to reveal a crystal locket of exquisite craftsmanship. The pendant was carved from a single piece of clear quartz, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the moonlight. At its heart lay a tiny compartment containing a lock of dark hair so fine it might have been spun from shadow itself. "Open it," Evangeline whispered. Cordelia's fingers trembled as she worked the delicate clasp. Inside the crystal chamber, nestled beside the lock of hair, was a miniature portrait painted on ivory. The face that looked back at her was Seraphina's, but rendered with such intimate detail that it could only have been painted by someone who loved her deeply. Around the portrait's edge, etched in script so tiny it was barely legible, ran the inscription, "My beloved Seraphina until time's end, A.R." A.R., Cordelia breathed. Alaric Ravencourt. "He loved her," Evangeline said simply. "This wasn't made for a ceremonial selection. This was made for a woman he intended to marry out of love, not obligation." The crystal locket grew warm in Cordelia's palm, and she could swear she felt a pulse of energy that synchronized with the bloodstone pendant around her neck. The two artifacts seemed to recognize each other, their combined presence creating a sensation of completeness she hadn't realized she'd been missing. "Where did Mother get this?" she asked. "I don't know, but I suspect it's been passed down through the Ravencroft line for generations. What troubles me is that Mother must know about the connection between our family and Lord Alaric's past, yet she's said nothing even after his selection of you." A rustling in the nearby bushes made both sisters tense. From the shadows stepped Father Benedict, his elderly frame moving with surprising stealth. His weathered face bore an expression of grave concern as he approached the pavilion. "Ladies Thornfield," he said formally, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken secrets. "I had hoped to speak with you both privately about matters of family history." "Father Benedict," Cordelia stood, instinctively clutching the crystal locket. "How much did you hear?" "Enough to know that the truth I've helped conceal for 4 decades is finally coming to light." The priest stepped into the pavilion, his eyes immediately drawn to the locket in Cordelia's hands. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, she handed him the pendant. Father Benedict examined it carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This belonged to Seraphina Ravencroft," he confirmed. "I performed the blessing upon it myself, though I was barely more than a novice at the time. It was meant to be her wedding gift from Lord Alaric, a token of love that would bind their souls together across eternity. But she died before the ceremony," Evangeline said. Father Benedict's laugh was bitter. "Died? Child, Seraphina Ravencroft did not die. She was murdered, along with most of her family, in an attack orchestrated by those who feared what her union with Lord Alaric might bring about." Cordelia sank back onto the bench, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a horrifying picture. The fire that scarred her, it wasn't an accident. Lord Blackthorn's ancestor led the attack, believing that preventing the marriage would somehow break Lord Alaric's power over the region. They underestimated the depth of his love and the lengths to which he would go to preserve what remained of his beloved. The priest returned the locket to Cordelia, his hands shaking slightly. The binding ritual that was meant to unite them in marriage became instead a preservation of Seraphina's soul, scattered across time and bloodline until she could return to complete what was begun. "You're saying that Cordelia is," Evangeline began, "the vessel for Seraphina's return?" "Yes, not merely her descendant, but the inheritor of her very essence." Father Benedict's gaze met Cordelia's directly. "The scars you bear are not from a childhood accident, my dear. They are the marks of Seraphina's death, carried forward through the centuries as a sign of recognition." The crystal locket pulsed with warm light, and suddenly Cordelia could hear whispers, not the vague murmurs that sometimes accompanied her music box, but clear voices speaking words of love and longing in languages she somehow understood. "The village children who attacked the mill that day," she said slowly, pieces falling into place. "They weren't acting on their own, were they?" Father Benedict's silence was answer enough. "There are those who still oppose the union," he finally admitted. "The Blackthorn line has not forgotten their ancestors' cause. They believe that allowing the binding to be completed will grant Lord Alaric power beyond anything this world has seen. And they're willing to kill to prevent it," Cordelia realized, her hand moving instinctively to her scarred cheek. Father Benedict's revelation hung heavy in the moonlit air as the three of them sat in contemplative silence. The crystal locket continued to pulse with gentle warmth in Cordelia's palm, as if responding to the emotions that churned within her. To learn that her entire life had been shaped by forces beyond her understanding, that even her childhood trauma had been orchestrated by ancient enemies, left her feeling unmoored from everything she had believed about herself. "There's more you need to know," Father Benedict said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of decades-old secrets. "Martha is dying, and before she passes, she has requested to speak with you both. The fever has broken her final restraints, and she's determined to reveal everything before her strength fails entirely." They found Martha propped up in her narrow bed, attended by the village physician, who looked both puzzled and concerned. The old woman's eyes, though sunken with illness, burned with an intensity that spoke of urgent purpose. "Dr. Henley," Father Benedict addressed the physician quietly, "would you give us some privacy? This is a matter of family history." The doctor nodded, gathering his instruments. "I've done all I can for her. The fever has broken, but her heart grows weaker by the hour. I fear she has very little time remaining." When they were alone, Martha turned her gaze to Cordelia with an expression of profound love mixed with desperate urgency. "My dearest child," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "come closer. There are truths I must share before I join my beloved Sarah in whatever realm awaits us." Cordelia knelt beside the bed, taking Martha's frail hand in both of hers. The old woman's skin felt paper-thin, as if she were already beginning to fade from the physical world. "You know now about Seraphina, about what she was to Lord Alaric," Martha began, her breathing labored but determined. "What you don't know is that I was not merely her nursemaid. I was her mother," Evangeline gasped. But Cordelia felt only a strange sense of completion, as if a missing piece of a vast puzzle had finally clicked into place. 3 centuries ago I was Lady Cordelia Ravenshollow, Seraphina's mother and the widow of Lord Alaric Ravenshollow. When my husband died fighting in the King's Wars, I was left to protect our lands and our daughter alone. Lord Alaric was our closest neighbour and most trusted ally. The marriage between him and Seraphina was arranged not for politics or wealth, but for love that had grown over years of friendship and mutual respect. Martha paused, her eyes closing as she gathered strength. The Blackthorns and their allies saw that union as a threat to their own ambitions. They believed that combining Alaric's supernatural power with the Ravenshollow bloodline would create something beyond their ability to control or destroy. "So they attacked," Cordelia said softly. "They came in the night with blessed silver and consecrated fire, weapons blessed by corrupt priests who had been bought with blackthorn gold. They burned our hall and slaughtered our people, but Seraphina and I escaped through the old tunnels that connected our castle to Alaric's domain." Martha's grip tightened on Cordelia's hand. "We almost reached safety. Almost. But they caught us at the river crossing, and their leader, Marcus Blackthorn, carried a blade that had been dipped in holy water and blessed with curses against the undead. When he struck Seraphina, the wound was mortal not just to her body, but to her very soul." Tears slipped down the old woman's cheeks as she continued. "Alaric found us there, my daughter dying in my arms, her beautiful face ruined by silver fire. In his grief and rage, he offered to bind his own essence to hers, to preserve her soul beyond death itself. But such magic requires a terrible price. From beneath her pillow, Martha withdrew a scroll of parchment so old it seemed ready to crumble at the slightest touch. The document was covered in text, written in what appeared to be blood, the letters still glowing faintly with supernatural power. "The binding contract," Father Benedict breathed, recognizing the artifact immediately. "Read it aloud," Martha commanded, her voice gaining strength from some final reserve. "Let them understand what their love has cost, and what it may yet demand." Father Benedict took the parchment with reverent care, his Latin education allowing him to translate the ancient words, "By blood and soul, by love that transcends death, I, Alaric of the house Ravencourt, do bind my eternal essence to that of Seraphina Ravencroft, beloved of my heart. Let her spirit find vessel and form through her bloodline, until such time as our union may be completed. In exchange for this preservation, I accept eternal solitude, bound to choose and lose a bride each century until the true beloved returns. Let no force of earth or heaven break this bond, save by the willing consent of both souls united. Signed in blood, under the witness of eternity." The scroll glowed brighter as the words were spoken, responding to the power inherent in its ancient promises. "For 3 centuries Alaric has honored that contract," Martha whispered. "Each 100 years he awakens and chooses a bride, knowing she is not his true love, knowing he must eventually release her back to mortality when the binding proves false. Each time he hopes that Seraphina's soul has found its way home." And now it has, Cordelia realized, her hand moving to the bloodstone pendant that pulsed in rhythm with the contract's glow. "But completing the binding will not be easy," Martha warned. "The same forces that destroyed us centuries ago still work against this union. Lord Marcus Blackthorne may be long dead, but his descendant carries on. The family mission. Young Lord Cedric Blackthorne has been gathering allies, preparing for this moment when Seraphina's return would signal the opportunity to end the threat once and for all." Evangeline had remained silent throughout the revelation, but now she stepped forward with an expression of growing alarm. "Martha, when you speak of Lord Cedric Blackthorne, he was here 2 days ago. He came to call on me, expressing sympathy for my situation and offering his support." Martha's eyes widened with fear. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing specific, but—" Evangeline's face went pale. "I may have mentioned that Cordelia had been acting strangely, that she seemed to know things she shouldn't know. He was very interested in that information." The old woman struggled to sit up, her urgency overriding her physical weakness. "Then time is shorter than I hoped. Cedric will not wait for the binding to be completed. He will strike first, using the same methods his ancestor employed. Blessed silver and consecrated fire," Father Benedict said grimly. "And he knows where to find the artifacts needed to make such weapons truly deadly to both Alaric and Seraphina's soul." Martha fixed Cordelia with an intense stare. "The contract can be rewritten, child, but only by one who carries both bloodlines, Ravencroft and Ravencourt. Your union with Alaric will create that possibility, but first you must survive Blackthorne's attempt to prevent it." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses' hooves on cobblestone echoed from the village square below. Through the window, they could see torches moving in organized formation, too many and too purposeful to be a coincidental late-night gathering. "They come," Martha whispered, her strength finally beginning to fail. "Remember, dearest child, love is stronger than fear, stronger than death itself. Trust in that truth, and you may yet rewrite the contract that has bound you both for so long." The binding contract in Father Benedict's hands burst into brilliant flame, not consumed but transformed. its blood-red text shifting to silver as if preparing for the final test that approached with the thunder of hostile hooves. The riders' torches cast dancing shadows through the village streets as Lord Cedric Blackthorn led his armed company toward Thornfield Manor. From Martha's window, Cordelia could see the glint of silver weapons and smell the acrid smoke of blessed fires that burned with unnatural intensity. The very air seemed to recoil from their presence, and she understood with chilling clarity that these were not ordinary men seeking ordinary vengeance. "We need to reach Lord Alaric," Father Benedict declared, carefully rolling the transformed binding contract and secreting it within his robes. "The manor is indefensible against weapons blessed for supernatural warfare." But even as he spoke, the sound of splintering wood echoed from below. Cedric's men had reached the front entrance and were forcing their way inside with the confidence of those who believed righteousness was on their side. "The hidden passage," Martha whispered, her voice growing weaker by the moment. "Behind the tapestry in the great hall, it leads to the castle dungeons. Serafina and I used it centuries ago when we fled the first attack." Evangeline moved to the window, her face pale with fear. "There are too many of them. Even if we reach the passage, they'll follow us." "Not all of us need to go," Cordelia said quietly, a strange calm settling over her as the pieces of her destiny finally aligned. "They're here for me. If I surrender myself—" "No." Martha's voice carried surprising force for one so near death. "That is exactly what they want. Cedric believes that destroying you before the binding is complete will end the threat forever. He doesn't understand that killing you now would only scatter Serafina's soul once more, condemning both you and Alaric to another cycle of searching and separation." Heavy footsteps pounded on the stairs leading to the servants' quarters. They had perhaps minutes before Blackthorn's men reached Martha's chamber. "There is another way," Father Benedict said suddenly, his eyes lighting with desperate inspiration. "The soul mirror in the castle's chapel. It's one of the 3 great artifacts that can reveal the true nature of any spirit. If we can reach it, we can prove to Cedric that destroying you would only perpetuate the cycle he seeks to end." "You speak as if Lord Blackthorn might listen to reason," Evangeline observed skeptically. "Cedric is not his ancestor," the priest replied. "He's been raised on stories and hatred, but he's not inherently evil. If he understood the true consequences of his actions, he might be willing to seek another solution." The sound of doors being kicked open grew closer. Martha struggled to sit up, pressing something small and cold into Cordelia's palm. "Take this," she whispered. "When you reach the mirror, hold this against your heart and speak the words I taught you as a child, the lullaby you could never quite remember learning." Cordelia looked down to find an ornate silver key, its head carved in the shape of a raven with outstretched wings. The metal felt ancient beyond measure, yet it warmed to her touch, as if recognizing its rightful owner. "The chapel key," Father Benedict breathed. "I wondered what had become of it after the original attack." "Go now," Martha commanded, with the last of her strength. "I will delay them as long as possible." They slipped from the chamber through a servant's back stair, leaving Martha to face whatever came next. As they descended, Cordelia could hear the old woman's voice rising in what sounded like prayer, though the words were in a language far older than Latin. The hidden passage behind the great hall tapestry was exactly as Martha had described, a narrow tunnel carved from the living rock, wide enough for one person to pass, but easily defended from either end. Father Benedict led the way with a small lantern, while Evangeline brought up the rear, clutching a silver cross that had belonged to their grandfather. The tunnel seemed to stretch for miles, though Cordelia knew it could not be more than half that distance. The walls were carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the lantern light, and more than once she thought she heard whispers echoing from side passages that branched off into the darkness. The old religion ran deeper in these lands than Rome ever imagined, Father Benedict explained as they walked. These tunnels were sacred long before Christianity arrived, and they remember the power that once flowed through them. When they finally emerged into the castle dungeons, the change in atmosphere was immediately apparent. The air hummed with energy, and every stone seemed to pulse with ancient magic responding to Cordelia's presence. The bloodstone pendant around her neck grew so warm it was almost uncomfortable, while the crystal locket pulsed in harmony with her heartbeat. The chapel lay at the castle's heart, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows above. Stained glass windows depicted scenes that were not quite Christian angels with too many wings, saints whose halos bore runic inscriptions, and a central window showing a figure that might have been Christ, or might have been something far older, blessing a union between mortal and immortal lovers. At the chapel's center stood the soul mirror, mounted on an altar that predated the Christian conversion of the castle by centuries. The mirror itself was not glass, but polished obsidian, its surface so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Around its circular frame, carved words in a dozen ancient languages promised truth to those brave enough to look upon their own souls. "I don't understand," Evangeline said as they approached the altar. "How will a mirror convince Lord Blackthorn of anything?" "The soul mirror shows not physical form but spiritual truth," Father Benedict explained. "It reveals the essence of whatever looks into it, stripping away all pretense and deception. If Cordelia truly carries Serafina's soul, the mirror will show that reality beyond any possibility of doubt." Cordelia stepped before the obsidian surface, holding Martha's silver key against her heart as she had been instructed. The lullaby rose to her lips unbidden, words in a language she had never learned but somehow knew as intimately as her own heartbeat. "Sera mith velon, ninmeleth, sera mith velon sui amar, estelio hon, gweneth vuin. A kind, vuin be kin o kind." As the ancient words echoed through the chapel, the soul mirror began to glow with soft, silver light. The obsidian surface rippled like water, and suddenly Cordelia was looking not at her own reflection, but at something far more profound. Two figures appeared in the mirror's depths, herself as she truly was, and overlapping her form like a double exposure, the luminous spirit of Serafina Ravencroft. The two souls were not separate entities, but aspects of the same essential being, one mortal vessel containing an immortal essence that had waited 3 centuries to return home. But there was more. As the vision deepened, Cordelia could see the silver threads that connected her soul to another Lord Alaric himself, who materialized in the mirror as if summoned by the revelation of their eternal bond. The binding contract they had spoken of was not merely words on parchment, but a living connection that joined their very essences across time and space. "By all the saints," Father Benedict whispered, "you're not just carrying Serafina's soul, you are Serafina, reborn into mortal form." The chapel doors burst open as Lord Blackthorn and his men stormed inside, their blessed silver weapons gleaming in the mirror's ethereal light. Cedric himself was younger than Cordelia had. He expected. Perhaps 30 years old, with the sharp features and dark hair that marked his bloodline. His eyes held fanatical determination as he raised a sword that glowed with consecrated power. "Step away from the mirror, witch," he commanded. "Your deception ends here." But as Cedric looked toward the soul mirror to confirm his target, the obsidian surface turned its revelatory power upon him as well. What appeared in its depths made him stagger backward, his weapon wavering in suddenly nerveless hands. The mirror showed not just Cordelia and Serafina's merged soul, but the truth about Cedric himself. There, revealed in spiritual clarity, was the mark of his ancestors' crime, not pride or righteousness, but a dark stain of murder and betrayal that had been passed down through generations. Marcus Blackthorn had not acted from noble motives, but from jealousy and greed, seeking to claim both Serafina and her family's lands for himself. More shocking still, the mirror revealed that Marcus Blackthorne had been bound to the same cycle of return as his victims. His corrupted soul had been reborn again and again in his bloodline, each incarnation driven to complete the destruction he had begun 3 centuries ago. "No," Cedric breathed, his sword clattering to the stone floor. I'm not him. I'm trying to protect the world from supernatural tyranny." "You're trying to finish what your ancestor started," Cordelia said gently, the truth becoming clear as she spoke. "But he wasn't protecting anyone. He was trying to steal what belonged to another, and when he couldn't have it, he chose to destroy it instead." The soul mirror's light intensified, and suddenly Lord Alaric himself materialized in the chapel, drawn by the spiritual resonance of the ancient artifacts coming together. His presence filled the sacred space with power that made the very stones sing with recognition. Cedric Blackthorne, Lord Alaric's voice, carried centuries of patient authority. "Look upon the truth and choose. Will you continue your ancestors' path of destruction, or will you help us break the cycle that has bound us all in endless repetition of ancient wrongs?" The young lord stared into the soul mirror, seeing his own tortured history reflected in its obsidian depths. For a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, the fate of all their intertwined souls hung in the balance. The silence in the chapel stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Cedric Blackthorne stood frozen before the soul mirror, his face a mask of horror and disbelief as he confronted the truth of his ancestral legacy. Behind him, his men shifted uneasily, their blessed weapons suddenly feeling heavy in hands that no longer seemed certain of their righteous purpose. "This cannot be real," Cedric whispered, his voice breaking like a child's. "My family has served as guardians against supernatural corruption for 300 years. We are the protectors, not the villains of this tale." Lord Alaric stepped forward, his ancient eyes filled with something that might have been compassion. "Your family has been enslaved to a lie for 3 centuries, Cedric. Marcus Blackthorne poisoned your bloodline with his jealousy and greed, and each generation has inherited both his hatred and his crimes." The soul mirror continued to pulse with revealing light, showing not just the past, but potential futures, branching out like rivers from this moment of choice. In some visions, Cedric completed his ancestors' work, destroying both Cordelia and Alaric, but dooming himself to another cycle of reincarnation and hatred. In others, he chose differently, breaking the chain of revenge that had bound all their souls in endless repetition. "There is a way to end this," Father Benedict said, his voice cutting through the supernatural tension. "But it requires courage from all of us. The courage to choose love over fear, forgiveness over vengeance." From within his robes, the priest withdrew another artifact that none of them had seen before, a ceremonial dagger whose blade seemed to be forged from starlight itself. The weapon was beautiful beyond description, its edge sharp enough to cut through the barriers between worlds, its hilt carved with symbols of binding and release. The dagger of severance. Lord Alaric breathed, recognizing the blade immediately. "I had thought it lost forever." "Hidden, not lost," Father Benedict corrected. "The Church has been its guardian since the night of the original tragedy, waiting for the moment when it might be used to heal rather than harm." Evangeline stepped closer to examine the dagger, her face pale but resolute. "What does it do?" "It can cut through any binding, break any curse, sever any connection between souls," the priest explained. "But its power is double-edged. In the wrong hands, it could destroy the bond between Cordelia and Serafina permanently, scattering her soul beyond any hope of recovery. In the right hands, it could rewrite the very contract that has held you all prisoner." Cordelia felt Serafina's memories stirring within her consciousness, ancient knowledge rising to the surface like water finding its level. "The dagger chooses its wielder," she said, though she wasn't certain how she knew this. It cannot be taken by force or used for purposes contrary to its nature. As if responding to her words, the ceremonial dagger began to levitate from Father Benedict's hands, rotating slowly in the air above the altar. Its starlight blade cast prismatic reflections across the chapel walls, and each person present could see their own face reflected in its surface, not as they appeared to others, but as their souls truly were. "Who among us is worthy?" Cedric asked, his voice hollow with the weight of revealed truth. "Perhaps," Lord Alaric suggested gently, "the question is not who is worthy, but who is willing to sacrifice their own desires for the greater good." The chapel doors burst open again, but this time it was not armed men who entered. Martha appeared in the doorway, though she looked different than before, younger, stronger, as if her approaching death had stripped away centuries of accumulated weariness. Behind her came Lady Margaret and Lord Reginald Thornfield, their faces etched with concern and confusion. "Cordelia!" Lady Margaret cried, rushing toward her daughter. "When we found Martha's chamber empty and the servants speaking of Lord Blackthorn's attack, we feared the worst." Mother, father. Cordelia embraced them both, drawing comfort from their familiar presence, even as she felt Seraphina's memories threatening to overwhelm her mortal consciousness. "There are things you need to understand about our family, about who I really am. I know exactly who you are," Lady Margaret said softly, surprising everyone present. "I have always known. Did you think a mother could fail to recognize the soul of her own ancestor looking out through her daughter's eyes?" The revelation sent ripples of shock through the assembled group. Lord Reginald stared at his wife in amazement. "Margaret, what are you saying?" "I am saying that we Ravencrofts have been the keepers of this secret for 300 years, waiting for the day when Seraphina would return to complete what was begun." Lady Margaret turned to face Lord Alaric with dignity that spoke of noble bloodlines. "My lord, my family has served yours faithfully through the centuries, protecting the bloodline and preserving the artifacts that would be needed for this moment." From beneath her travelling cloak, she withdrew a silk-wrapped bundle that she placed reverently upon the altar beside the floating dagger. When she unwrapped it, the chapel filled with gasps of wonder. It was a crown not of gold or silver, but woven from thorns that had been transmuted into something resembling black crystal. Each thorn caught and reflected the chapel's supernatural light, creating patterns that seemed to write themselves across the vaulted ceiling above. "The crown of thorns," Martha whispered, her restored voice carrying notes of ancient reverence. "Seraphina's burial crown, crafted from the roses that grew on her grave and blessed with her own life's blood. When she died," Lady Margaret explained, "Seraphina's crown was supposed to be buried with her. Instead, it was saved by those who believe she would return. It has been passed down through the Ravencroft women, waiting for the day when the true heir would need to claim her spiritual inheritance." The crown began to glow with the same inner light as the bloodstone pendant and crystal locket, creating a resonance that made the very air sing with power. Cordelia could feel it calling to her, recognizing the soul it had been created to honor. "If I put it on," she asked, understanding somehow what the crown represented, "will I still be myself, or will I become completely Seraphina?" "You will become who you were always meant to be," Martha replied. "Neither fully mortal nor fully the ancient spirit, but something new, a bridge between past and present, carrying the best of both lives within a single soul." Lord Blackthorn's men had been watching this exchange with growing unease. Their captain, a grizzled veteran named Garrett, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "My Lord Cedric," he said carefully, "perhaps we should reconsider our mission here. These people speak of breaking cycles and choosing forgiveness. Maybe there's truth in their words." But Cedric seemed lost in his own internal struggle, staring at the soul mirror as it continued to show him visions of what he might become. 300 years, he murmured. 300 years my family has lived with this hatred, and now you tell me It was built on a lie. Not a lie, Lord Alaric corrected gently. A wound that was never allowed to heal. Your ancestors' jealousy became a poison that infected every generation that followed. But poison can be cleansed, wounds can be healed, if we have the courage to choose a different path. The ceremonial dagger continued its slow rotation above the altar, its starlight blade now pulsing in rhythm with the other artifacts. Father Benedict studied its movement with the intensity of one reading ancient scripture. "It's making its choice," he announced. "The dagger is deciding who will wield it in the final moment." As if responding to his words, the weapon's rotation began to slow, its point gradually aligning with different people in the chapel. When it pointed toward Lord Alaric, the blade flared with silver light. When it turned toward Cordelia, it burned with gold. But when it indicated Cedric Blackthorne, something unexpected happened. The starlight blade erupted with pure white radiance that was almost too bright to look upon. "No," Cedric said, backing away from the altar. "I cannot. I am the enemy. Here, the descendant of those who caused this suffering. How can I be the one chosen to end it?" "Perhaps," Evangeline said quietly, speaking for the first time since the revelations began, "that is exactly why you must be the one. Love can transform even the deepest hatred, but only if someone has the courage to make the first gesture of trust." Outside the chapel, the sound of more horses approaching echoed through the castle courtyard. Through the stained glass windows, they could see more torches gathering reinforcements that Cedric had apparently summoned before entering the chapel. "My lord," Captain Garrett said urgently, "if you do not give the signal soon, my men outside will assume the worst and storm the chapel. There will be bloodshed that cannot be undone." The moment of choice had arrived. The ceremonial dagger hung suspended above the altar, waiting for hands brave enough to grasp its starlight blade. The crown of thorns pulsed with patient power, ready to transform whoever wore it. And in the soul mirror's obsidian depths, the futures continued to branch and shift, each possible outcome depending on the decisions made in the next few heartbeats. Cordelia felt Seraphina's courage flowing through her veins like wine, strengthening her resolve for whatever came next. Lord Alaric stood ready to protect her with his immortal strength, but she knew that this battle would not be won through force alone. Martha's ancient wisdom, her parents' love, Evangeline's growing understanding, Father Benedict's faith, all of these would be needed to transform centuries of hatred into something resembling hope. The dagger's light intensified, demanding an answer that could no longer be delayed. The ceremonial dagger's light reached a crescendo that filled every corner of the chapel with brilliance, demanding a choice that would reshape the destinies of everyone present. In that moment of suspended time, Cordelia felt Seraphina's memories flooding through her consciousness, not as foreign experiences, but as her own forgotten past, returning home. "I remember," she whispered, her voice carrying notes of an accent that belonged to another century. "I remember the night Marcus Blackthorne came with his blessed silver, the way the fire burned not just my flesh, but my very soul. I remember Alaric's tears as he held my dying body, and the terrible bargain we made to preserve what could be saved of our love." The crown of thorns rose from the altar of its own accord, hovering above Cordelia's head like a dark halo. Its crystalline thorns caught the dagger's light and transformed it, casting patterns on the chapel walls that told the story of 3 centuries of separation and yearning. "Cordelia, no." Evangeline reached toward her sister, fear evident in her voice. "What if putting it on changes you so much that we lose who you really are?" "Then you'll help me remember," Cordelia replied, her dark eyes now holding depths that spoke of lifetimes, lived and lost. "You'll remind me that I am both women, the village girl who loves her family and the ancient lady who loved an immortal lord. Neither identity negates the other." As the crown of thorns settled onto her head, the transformation was immediate and breathtaking. Cordelia's simple blue dress shimmered and changed, becoming the rich burgundy velvet gown from Seraphina's portrait. Her posture straightened with noble bearing, while her scars, rather than disappearing, blazed with silver light that spoke of survival rather than defeat. "My beloved," Lord Alaric breathed, stepping toward her with 3 centuries of longing evident in every movement. But before they could embrace, the chapel doors exploded inward as Cedric's reinforcements stormed inside, having mistaken the supernatural light for signs of battle. These were not the conflicted men who had followed Cedric into the chapel, but hardened soldiers who had been raised on stories of supernatural evil and trained to destroy it without question. "Demon!" their leader shouted, raising a crossbow loaded with a bolt of blessed silver. "Release Lord Blackthorn from your enchantment." The bolt flew true, aimed directly at Cordelia's heart, but the crown of thorns pulsed with protective power, and the blessed silver disintegrated before it could touch her transformed form. "Stand down!" Cedric commanded his men, but they were beyond listening to reason. They saw only what their training had taught them to see: supernatural creatures threatening their lord's life. The battle erupted with shocking violence. Lord Alaric moved with inhuman speed, disarming soldiers before they could bring their blessed weapons to bear. Father Benedict began chanting in Latin, calling upon divine protection for all present. Martha, her restored youth, allowing her to fight with skills learned in an earlier life, wielded a silver cross like a weapon of divine authority. But it was Cordelia who commanded the chapel's attention. The crown of thorns had awakened powers that had slumbered in Seraphina's bloodline for centuries. With each gesture, ancient magic responded to her will, not dark necromancy, but the pure force of love given supernatural form. "Enough!" she commanded, her voice carrying harmonics that made the chapel stones ring like bells. "I will not have blood shed in sacred space over old hatreds." A wave of force emanated from the crown of thorns, not harming the soldiers, but compelling them to lower their weapons. The power was not domination but persuasion, showing them glimpses of the truth that the soul mirror had revealed. "You see," Cedric said to his men, his voice breaking with revelation, "this is not the evil we were taught to fear. This is love, love so pure it survived death itself, and so powerful it refuses to be corrupted by revenge." The ceremonial dagger continued to float above the altar, its starlight blade now pulsing in rhythm with Cordelia's heartbeat. She approached it slowly, understanding that the weapon's true purpose was not to destroy, but to transform. "The binding contract," she said, turning to Father Benedict. "Show it to me." The priest withdrew the ancient parchment, its blood-red text now glowing with silver fire. "It has been changing since you put on the crown," he observed. "The words are rewriting themselves." Cordelia studied the document, reading it with Seraphina's ancient knowledge. It was never meant to be a prison, she realized. It was meant to be a doorway, a way for love to transcend the boundaries of mortality and death. But it needed both souls to be present and willing to complete the transformation. Lord Alaric joined her before the altar, his own immortal nature resonating with the power she now wielded. "Together," he said simply. "Together," she agreed. They reached for the ceremonial dagger simultaneously, their hands meeting on its starlight blade. The moment their fingers touched the weapon, the chapel filled with music not heard but felt, as if the very stones were singing hymns of joy and completion. The dagger's power flowed through them both, rewriting not just the binding contract, but the fundamental nature of their connection. No longer would Alaric be condemned to eternal solitude, choosing brides he could not love. No longer would Seraphina's soul wander through reincarnations, searching for what had been lost. But even as the transformation began, Cedric Blackthorn stepped forward with purpose that surprised them all. Cedric Blackthorn approached the altar with steps that seemed to grow steadier with each moment, as if the soul mirror's revelation had finally freed him from 3 centuries of inherited hatred. In his hands he carried something that made everyone in the chapel gasp with wonder, a quill pen that seemed to be crafted from living flame. The phoenix feather quill, Lord Alaric breathed, recognizing the artifact immediately. Where did you find it? It has been in my family's possession since the night of the original attack, Cedric replied, his voice heavy with newfound understanding. My ancestor took it from Seraphina's writing desk, believing it was merely a valuable curiosity. Only now do I understand its true purpose. The quill blazed with golden fire that cast no heat, its ethereal flames dancing along the translucent feather in patterns that spoke of rebirth and renewal. This was no ordinary writing instrument, but one of the three great artifacts of transformation, capable of rewriting not just words on parchment, but the very laws that governed fate itself. It was meant to be used for our wedding vows, Cordelia said, Seraphina's memories providing context that made her heart ache with centuries-old loss. We were to rewrite the standard ceremony, creating something new that would honor both mortal love and immortal devotion. Instead, Cedric continued, his eyes bright with tears of recognition, it can be used to transform the binding contract into something that heals rather than imprisons. The ceremonial dagger still pulsed with starlight in Cordelia and Alaric's joined hands, its power flowing through them both, but waiting for the final element that would complete the transformation. As Cedric approached with the phoenix feather quill, the three artifacts began to resonate together, creating harmonics that made the very air shimmer with possibility. Lord Blackthorn, Father Benedict said formally, do you renounce the hatred that has bound your bloodline for 3 centuries? Do you choose forgiveness over vengeance, healing over destruction? Cedric knelt before the altar, placing the phoenix feather quill beside the floating dagger and glowing contract. I renounce the sins of my ancestor and claim the right to choose a different path. Let the cycle of hatred end with me, and let love finally triumph over fear. The moment the words left his lips, the chapel erupted with light so brilliant it seemed to pierce the barriers between worlds. The phoenix feather quill rose to hover beside the ceremonial dagger, both artifacts spinning slowly around the binding contract as ancient magic rewrote the very foundations of their supernatural prison. Cordelia felt power flowing through her unlike anything she had experienced, not the crushing weight of destiny, but the liberating force of choice, finally made real. The crown of thorns on her head blazed with silver fire, while the bloodstone pendant and crystal locket pulsed in perfect harmony. Now, she said, understanding instinctively what needed to be done, we rewrite not just the contract, but the very nature of the binding itself. She and Alaric guided the ceremonial dagger toward the phoenix feather quill, and when the two artifacts touched, the transformation began in earnest. The binding contract, which had glowed with blood-red text for 3 centuries, suddenly blazed with golden script that wrote itself across the parchment in words of hope rather than obligation. The new text read not of eternal servitude and cyclical choosing, but of love, freely given and freely received. Instead of condemning Alaric to choose a new bride each century, the rewritten contract established him and Cordelia as partners in protecting the village and surrounding lands, immortal guardians who would serve not out of compulsion, but from willing devotion. The curse becomes a blessing, Martha whispered, her ancient eyes bright with joy. The prison becomes a sanctuary. But the transformation was not complete. As the phoenix feather quill rewrote the contract, it began to offer each person present a choice that would affect their own destiny. Cedric Blackthorn found the hatred literally lifting from his soul, replaced by a sense of purpose that had been denied to his bloodline for 300 years. He could choose to serve as a protector alongside Cordelia and Alaric, using his family's knowledge of supernatural threats to defend rather than destroy. Evangeline watched her sister's transformation with a mixture of awe and loss, understanding that while Cordelia would always love her family, she now belonged to a larger purpose. But the phoenix feather quill offered her a choice as well. She could remain mortal and live a normal life, or she could accept a different kind of immortality, serving as a bridge between the supernatural realm and the mortal world. "I choose to stay," Evangeline declared, surprising everyone present. "Not for immortality, but to help others understand that love can triumph over fear. Our family's story deserves to be told, and I want to be the one who tells it." Father Benedict found his faith deepened and purified, his role as keeper of sacred mysteries affirmed by divine approval. Lady Margaret and Lord Reginald discovered that their love for their daughters was strong enough to accept transformations they couldn't fully understand. As the final words of the new contract blazed themselves into existence, the supernatural storm that had raged around them for days finally calmed. The chapel filled with the sound of bells ringing from the village below, not alarm bells, but celebration bells, as if the very stones of Ravenshollow recognized that an ancient wrong had finally been made right. The phoenix feather quill settled gently onto the altar beside the now transformed contract, its golden flames dimming to a gentle glow. The ceremonial dagger's starlight blade reflected the joy on every face present, while the crown of thorns on Cordelia's head pulsed with contentment rather than urgent power. "It is finished," Lord Alaric said, his voice carrying wonder at the simple truth of it. "After 3 centuries of separation, it is finally finished." But as he spoke, simple golden bands appeared on both his and Cordelia's fingers, not the ornate jewelry of nobility, but humble rings that spoke of love chosen freely and commitment made without coercion. 6 months after the night that transformed everything, Ravenshollow had settled into a new rhythm that felt both strange and wonderfully familiar. The village that had once lived in fear of the century ritual now thrived under the protection of Lord Alaric and Lady Cordelia, whose union had brought not darkness but an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity. The wedding rings of eternity that had appeared on their fingers during the transformation proved to be more than mere symbols. These simple golden bands pulsed with a gentle warmth that connected their bearers not just to each other, but to the very life force of the land itself. Where once Lord Alaric's immortality had been a source of isolation and sorrow, it now became a gift shared with his beloved, not as a curse passed on, but as a choice freely made and joyfully embraced. Cordelia stood in the garden of Thornfield Manor, watching her parents tend to roses that bloomed with impossible vibrancy. The flowers seemed to respond to her presence, their petals unfurling in colors that had no names in mortal language. She was still recognizably herself, still the young woman who had grown up in her sister's shadow, but now that identity was enriched by Seraphina's memories and wisdom. "The morning light suits you," Lord Alaric observed, approaching through the garden with the silent grace that had once made villagers flee in terror. Now children ran to greet him in the streets, drawn by the kindness that radiated from his transformed nature. "It suits us both," Cordelia replied, taking his offered hand and feeling the familiar pulse of connection through their wedding rings. "I never imagined that immortality could feel so much like coming home." The castle had been transformed as well, its ancient stones warmed by love and laughter in ways they hadn't experienced for 3 centuries. The hall that had once hosted ceremonies of reluctant selection now welcomed villagers for harvest celebrations and seasonal festivals. The tower where Seraphina's portrait had waited in dusty solitude had become a library, where scholars from distant lands came to study the peaceful coexistence of mortal and immortal realms. Evangeline emerged from the manor carrying a leather-bound journal, her face bright with the enthusiasm that had replaced her earlier bitterness. "I've finished the first chapter," she announced, settling onto a garden bench beside them. "The account of our family's true history." Father Benedict thinks it might become the foundation for a new understanding between the mortal and supernatural worlds. And what do you think? Cordelia asked, genuinely curious about her sister's perspective. I think, Evangeline said carefully, that the most important stories are the ones that remind us love is always stronger than fear, even when fear seems more reasonable. She paused, looking at the wedding rings that caught the morning light. I also think I'm finally beginning to understand what true beauty really means. The transformation in Evangeline had been perhaps the most remarkable of all. Released from the pressure of being the perfect daughter, she had discovered talents and passions that had been overshadowed by her physical beauty. Her writings about their family's experience had already begun to circulate among scholars and clergy, offering new perspectives on the relationship between divine love and earthly devotion. Martha appeared at the garden gate, moving with the spry energy of someone who had been released from the weight of centuries-old secrets. Her true age remained a mystery even to herself, but the burden of guardianship had been lifted, replaced by the simple joy of watching her beloved charges finally find happiness. Lord Cedric has arrived with news from the capital, she announced, though her smile suggested the news was welcome. Cedric Blackthorne had indeed become an unexpected ally and friend. His transformation from would-be destroyer to protector had inspired similar changes throughout the region. Noble families that had spent generations preparing for supernatural threats now worked to build bridges between different communities. The knowledge that had once been used to craft weapons of blessed silver was now employed to create artifacts of protection and healing. The king has formally recognized your union and your authority over this region, Cedric reported as he joined them in the garden. More importantly, the church has declared your marriage a miracle rather than an abomination. Father Benedict's theological arguments were apparently quite persuasive. And the other vampire lords? Lord Alaric asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be hopeful. 3 have already sent emissaries asking for guidance in transforming their own binding contracts. It seems the story has given them hope that their own curses might become blessings. Cedric's smile was genuinely warm. The age of forced selection may be ending everywhere, replaced by something much more beautiful. As if summoned by their conversation, Father Benedict arrived with a small group of village children who had become regular visitors to the manor. The priest's role had evolved from keeper of fearful secrets to teacher of hope, and his sermons now focused on the transformative power of love rather than the dangers of supernatural corruption. Lady Cordelia, young Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter, tugged on her skirt. "Will you tell us the story again? The one about how love conquered fear?" Cordelia knelt to the child's level, her scarred face radiant with joy that made the old wounds seem like marks of honor rather than damage. "Which part would you like to hear, little one? The part where the scary vampire turned out to be sad instead of mean," the child said solemnly. "And the part where the hurt girl became a princess," added her brother. "And the part where everyone got to choose their own ending," chimed in a third child. As Cordelia began the tale that had become beloved throughout the village, Lord Alaric watched with wonder that never diminished. The wedding rings of eternity pulsed with gentle warmth, reminding them both that some love stories are so powerful they can rewrite the very laws of fate. The sun climbed higher over Ravenshollow, casting light that seemed somehow brighter and warmer than before. In the distance, the castle bells rang, not with ominous warning but with joyful celebration, marking another day in a community that had learned to embrace rather than fear the extraordinary. And in the garden where it all began, surrounded by family and friends who had chosen love over fear, Cordelia and Alaric continued their eternal story, not as prisoner and captor bound by ancient curse, but as partners in a love that had transformed darkness into light and made even immortality feel like a gift worth sharing.